The following program is being presented by Stetson University College of Law, the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law, and the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance Capital Case Litigation Initiative.
Welcome to Bloodstain Pattern Analysis Essentials, the 13th in our series of webinars for the Bureau of Justice Assistance Capital Litigation Initiative, Crime Scene to Courtroom Forensics Training. This webinar is produced by the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law and the Office of Professional Education at Stetson University College of Law. I'm your host, Mercy Roberg, Director of the Office of Professional Education at Stetson University College of Law. Joining me today is our expert, Toby Wolson. Mr. Wolson retired after 33 years of service as a criminalist and supervisor in the Forensic Biology section of the Miami-Dade Police Department Forensic Services Bureau. He has a Master's of Science degree from Michigan State University and is trained in serology, DNA, and bloodstain pattern analysis. Mr. Wolson has served as past president of the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysts and currently serves as the Organization of Scientific Area Committee's chair of the Bloodstain Pattern Analysis Subcommittee, OSAC. He is a member of the American Academy Forensic Sciences Standards Board Bloodstain Pattern Analysis Consensus Body, the chairperson of the International Association of Identification Bloodstain Pattern Analysis Science and Practice Subcommittee, and serves on the editorial boards of the AAFS Journal of Forensic Sciences and the IAI's Journal of Forensic Identification. Today for our chat feature, while the webinar is in progress, you can chat with us at any time. Use the chat feature found on the right-hand side of your login screen. We will answer as many of your questions as possible. Please note that we may not get to all of your questions while on the air. However, you may send your questions in to Stetson or Toby if you would like a follow-up answer. Your CLE information. This webinar is designed for both prosecutors and defense attorneys, and attendees who complete this webinar will be eligible for continuing legal education credits. The Stetson Office of Professional Education will work with each individual participant for reporting specifics. CLE applications will be made to Florida and to other states per individual requests. Please email us at ope@lawstetson.edu for further information. For our webinar today, bloodstain pattern analysis can provide critical information on the manner in which a crime was committed. We appreciate the experience and insights Mr. Wolson will be sharing with the legal community about the science of bloodstain pattern analysis and important considerations for selecting and working with a bloodstain pattern analysis expert. I will now turn things over to Mr. Wolson, and we will hope you enjoy the webinar.
Good morning. Welcome. As previously stated, my name is Toby Wolson, and I'm going to talk to you today about bloodstain pattern analysis, some of the basics about it, and some of the relevant topics. And the focus of this is to give you a basic understanding, because my experience has been that most attorneys, especially defense attorneys and public defender or prosecutors, have never dealt with a bloodstain pattern analyst, which means that when you get evidence of this type, you're unfamiliar with it and you need to be taught about it so that you can present it or defend against it. So the goal here today is to give you a thumbnail introduction to it that allows you to understand the science behind it, and then some of the relevant questions that have come up in recent times. Being a pattern science, most of the pattern sciences do take on a lot of interest because there's a possibility that people perceive them as being not science and subjective. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have an understanding that shows why this is good science and why subjectivity is not a problem with it. In fact, most forensics, be it DNA, chemistry, there's a level of subjectivity to all of them. All right, warning, the program includes graphic depictions of bloodstain pattern analysis that may be too intense for most sensitive viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. What I want to start out with is just a case study in which bloodstain pattern analysis helped answer questions. It involves a couple that was vacationing in Miami, and allegedly they are confronted by an individual with a handgun, and the one individual is shot in the head and is deceased, and the other individual is claiming that they were driving the car at the time the fatal shot was fired, and they're just an innocent bystander also. And in this particular case, the bloodstain pattern analysis was used to either confirm or contradict the story that was being told. So here's our car. Back in the days when this occurred, rental cars had a Y on the license plate, so bad guys on the street could spot these cars rather easily because they knew that the license plate meant that it was a rental car and a tourist was driving it. This is our decedent. She has a single gunshot wound that enters the right side of her head, transects the brain, and does not exit on the left side. The other interesting aspect about this picture is the bloodstain pattern on her shoulder, because that is an expirated pattern. We don't get to see those very often where we can clearly define those, because the characteristics of those patterns are very similar to other types of patterns we look at. This is the shooting scene. She was sitting in the front passenger seat. The window was open approximately 2 inches, and this particular individual is only 5'1", somewhere in that range. So that would place her head below the level of that open window. And at the time of the shooting, this is allegedly a moving car. So it's a really good shot to have occurred through that window, hitting somebody who is below the level of the opening. This is our driver. He says that as he's driving away, he realizes that she is making noises. He reaches over, touches her to see if she's okay, and sees that or feels that she's bleeding. So the blood on his hands are consistent with that story. And because he's sitting in the car, and we will show you that blood spattered across the car towards the driver, there is blood on his pants, which could possibly have come from some of that spattering. This is looking towards the driver. What you're seeing there is the center console between the seats, and there, being that we're looking for blood, it never fails in a car that it's going to be on red surfaces. But what you can see here is brain matter that's spattered across the car. I can't explain to you how that spatter occurs in terms of direction of travel, because there is no exit wound, but clearly it does spatter from the right side of the car towards the left side, even though her entry, the wound for her injury is on the right side of her head. This is where the driver was sitting. Again, he was relatively short, and in order to see over the steering wheel, he had a blanket folded up on the seat that he was sitting on. There is some blood present on the steering wheel. Again, that's consistent with what you saw on his right hand in the previous pictures. But of major interest is the door next to the driver, because there are very small blood stains on that door. Very small blood stains are usually indicative of a very forceful event, and they tend to travel very short distances, usually under 4 feet. But there are blood stains there, and those become of interest because they may help us interpret the shooting scene versus the driver's story. So we can reconstruct patterns, impact patterns, which I'll talk about later. We can reconstruct those to show where the blood source was that they originated from. In this particular case, they skipped some of the steps, which became a major point of discussion during later presentations. But they measured to see where the driver might be sitting. As I said, he was short. So the driver's seat was pulled all the way forward towards the steering wheel. They also measured to try and determine where her head may have been. Actually, this picture here I see as problematic because this was casework that wasn't done by me, to cite a point. I see this one as problematic because clearly the person sitting in the passenger seat had to be much taller than our decedent was. Now, we can look at bloodstains and determine the direction they were traveling in many cases when they hit a surface. And by working backwards, we can reconstruct or show where they came from. And the most common way of doing that without using a computer is by running strings from the stains at the determined angles that they impacted a surface, and then running those back towards our blood source. The step that was skipped in this particular reconstruction was finding an area convergence, which I'll discuss later. There was really no need to do that in this case because our decedent is in the car. We know that the blood source has to be her head, and we know that she's in the front passenger seat based on the blood around her. All right, so they run the strings backwards towards where she's sitting, and this is a good indication of the driver not having been present in the car at the time blood is being spattered about in that car, because we have three blood stains. If you notice towards the locking area of the door where the lock would be, there's three stains there. Those would have had to travel around the driver to get there. And that would have changed their direction to travel. So we know they didn't travel around because the direction of travel for them was directly back to where our blood source is. So what those tell the analysts working this scene is that the driver's not in the car at the time the blood is being spattered. That's a critical point because his story is that they're lost. They're driving around Miami. They see a man standing on a street corner. They pull up to ask him directions. They see him lifting up his gun, and he hits the gas and starts to speed away, and he hears the gunshot. So now with that story in mind and blood demonstrating that he's not sitting in that seat at the time the gunshot spatters blood, there's a major hole in his story. So this is an example of why we can use bloodstain pattern analysis to assist us with the interpretation. In most crime scenes, it's not the whole determinant factor. It's a piece of the puzzle, along with all the other investigative leads that are used, such as DNA, chemistry, whatever it may be. The last thing that demonstrated, by the way, that he wasn't in this car at the time the gunshot was fired is the blanket that's on the seat, because examination of that blanket revealed very small blood stains on the surface of it. If he had been sitting in that seat, he would have blocked those blood stains from being deposited on the blanket. So we have two pieces of evidence that say that he was not in the car at the time the shot was fired. Additional evidence that was recovered later was it was a very unique type of ammunition that was used to shoot her. They were able to trace that back to a particular type of gun, which they could demonstrate that he had purchased while traveling around the United States. They also found in his hotel room a box of unused ammunition matching what she was shot with. And then last but probably the least significant is he had a lot of insurance policies on her in which he was the beneficiary, which suggested there was a motive of money involved. So this is an example of how we can use bloodstain pattern analysis to assist us in our investigations. Now, how does it work? That's the big story I want to talk to you about because of the perception that it is not science, that it's art. That's a misperception. It follows the laws of physics. It's in particular fluid dynamics, and it's how we do our reconstructions is based in math. Historically, it's also perceived as a relatively new science, and it's not new. The perception is there because it's relatively new that we've been using it in a legal setting, but it has been traced back in the literature numerous years. One of the earliest publications identified was in 1895 by Edward Petrowski, in which he did extensive research concerning the origin, shape, detection, and distribution of bloodstains following head wounds caused by blows. By today's standards, his research wasn't politically correct because he took live animals and beat them to death and then recorded the patterns that he observed. 1939, we have Victor Balsart. He conducted research and experimentation and looked at bloodstain trajectories and patterns. He's actually the person that first identified that we could measure bloodstains from impact patterns and use them to reconstruct to show the approximate location of the blood sources that created that pattern. So those are both significant pieces of research well over 100 years ago for 1895 and a significant amount of time for Balsart. 1955 marks the first time it's really used in a criminal setting. In 1954, Dr. Sam Shepard was accused of beating his wife to death. Many people are familiar with the Shepard case because it was the motivation and the inspiration for The Fugitive, which was a TV series and several movies along the way. So many people are familiar with it. 1955, Paul Kirk examined the crime scene. They held it for a significant amount of time. And in 1956, he submitted to the court a sworn statement concerning the interpretation of the bloodstains, in which he basically said that the assailant had to be standing in a particular location at the time Marilyn was being beaten. She was beaten to death on her bed in her bedroom. And that not only could he identify where the assailant was standing, but based on his examination of the bloodstains, the assailant had to be left-handed. That was significant in that Dr. Shepard was right-handed. And his statement concerning what happened was that he was sleeping downstairs on the couch. He had fallen asleep. It was the 4th of July. And that he heard her scream. He ran up the stairs. He confronted a bushy-haired stranger in the bedroom, assaulting her, beating her. He didn't say what she was being beaten with, and that he struggled with that bushy-haired stranger and was knocked unconscious. He then says that when he came to, he could hear the bushy-haired stranger in the downstairs level of the house going through drawers and ransacking his office. So he runs downstairs. He confronts him again. The struggle then leads out of the house and ends up on the shore of Lake Erie because they had a lakefront home, at which point he gets knocked unconscious again and wakes up in the water. So the first person on the scene says that Dr. Shepard is all wet when he answers his door. All right, so going back, Dr. Kirk, who was a criminalist at the University of California, Berkeley campus, used bloodstain pattern analysis to interpret the crime scene. And that ultimately was used again in 1966 when Dr. Shepard had a second trial. The original trial, the Supreme Court ruled that it was not a fair trial, and it was overturned and sent back for retrial. So 1966, Dr. Kirk testifies, and that's probably the first testimony ever in the U.S. judicial system, let alone anywhere in the world, using bloodstain pattern analysis. Now, the birth of it for modern days, most people attribute to Herbert McDonald, who in 1971, under a federal grant, did research and published a small book on the flight characteristics and stain patterns of human blood. So what we do today is frequently by many people traced back to that publication. However, you need to keep in mind this is not new science, as I've showed you with the other dates. 1973 is the first bloodstain pattern analysis workshop. How do you learn bloodstain pattern analysis? Well, you attend workshops that teach you about the science behind it, that have you spattering blood, have you dripping blood, have you running with dripping blood. They put you through a series of experiments so that you can see how blood reacts under different physical forces and environments. So the very first of those workshops, and they're usually 40 hours in length, if not longer, was in 1973, and that was taught by Herb McDonald. 1983, the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysts, the IABPA, was founded. That is the largest professional group of people who work as bloodstain pattern analysis, and it's devoted strictly to the science and the education in it. In the 1990s, the International Association for Identification started a bloodstain pattern analysis certification program. Currently, that is the only certification program available for bloodstain pattern analyst. And it has numerous requirements before you can take the test. In particular, it requires a minimum of 100 hours of bloodstain pattern analysis training, coupled with an additional 100 or 140 hours or more of relevant training in related areas. So that would include photography, medical, legal, death investigation. But that 100 hours of bloodstain training is the important part, because many analysts prior to the 1990s only had a 40-hour course. And the reason they only had 40-hour courses was there were only introductory level courses available at that time. Starting in the late 80s and 1990s, instructors started realizing there was a need for advanced training, and they started developing courses that address advanced issues. So some of the courses that have been developed since the 1990s are, there is a math and physics course that is frequently offered, in which the analyst, through hands-on work and through lecture and testing, learns about the physics behind what we do and how we do it. There are fluid dynamics courses available, because this is a liquid. It has to follow the laws of fluid dynamics, so there's courses available to train bloodstain pattern analysts in how the fluid dynamics affect the creation of bloodstain patterns, how they affect blood droplets flying through the air and their flight characteristics. And then there's other courses available that are designed to enhance your skills. They're designed to enhance your understanding of the science. And probably the most recent addition to the cadre of courses available is bloodstain pattern analysis on textiles. Up until about 10 years ago, it was an area that was not heavily studied. And we now know that some of what we thought we knew was wrong. And it's now these courses dealing with the interaction of liquid blood on textiles answer many of the questions that existed, and show us how these interactions are affected by things such as the composition of the textile. How is it put together? Is it a weave? Is it a knit? Is it a tight weave? Is it a tight knit? It shows us that along with looking at those activities, we have to know the effects of laundering history, the effects of treatments that can be done to the fabric, and that examination of fabrics is much more complex than we ever thought. 2002 was the formation of the Scientific Working Group on Bloodstain Pattern Analysis. That was a group that was put together by the FBI to address creating standards and guidelines for the application of bloodstain pattern analysis. And then the SWIGs were disbanded in the early 2010s, and the government put together the OSAC, the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, which is essentially the same as the SWIGs, but the difference is that prior to the OSAC, all the SWIGs worked independent of each other and frequently didn't know what one another was doing. The OSAC combines them all into one organization so that we're all aware of what's going on and what each group's doing, and we have standards or guidelines for how we create our standards and our recommendations. So the OSAC, as I said, started in 2015, and until the end of September, I am the current chair of the OSAC BPA subcommittee, which is under the Physics and Pattern Scientific Area Committee, and I've been the chair of that subcommittee since 2015. All right, so what can we learn from bloodstain pattern analysis? Well, every crime scene is different. Some of them we can learn a lot, some of them we can learn nothing, and others we can learn somewhere in the middle. So there's an entire range of what we can learn, and it's very dependent on the activities that took place. It's very dependent on the surfaces that the blood is deposited on and other factors. So that's why there's this whole spectrum of what we can tell from any particular crime scene. So some of the things that we can learn type of activities that created the bloodstain patterns. Was this a hitting into blood that causes the splash, or was it a transected artery that causes the blood to spurt out like a squirt gun every time the heart beats. Some patterns, in particular impact patterns, we can reconstruct those patterns if they're on surfaces that don't distort the appearance of the pattern, allowing us to show the location of the blood source that created that pattern. If there are movements during the bloodshed activity, we can frequently interpret where those movements occurred and how they occurred, and things of that nature. Movements during bloodshed, if they stop while they're moving, that creates a different looking appearance of the patterns around it, so we can tell positions. And then movements after bloodshed. This is the individual who's bleeding, leaving the crime scene, or the individual who's may have perpetrated the crime, carrying away something that's blood coated, and if there's enough blood on it, the blood drips off. Probably the most famous blood movements after bloodshed is the blood trail that led from the crime scene at which Nicole Simpson, his body was at, to a house owned by O.J. Simpson. That is a blood trail, and that's caused by those type of movements in this particular case, because the pattern is so long, you would attribute that to an injury rather than dripping off of a weapon. The last thing on this page that I wanted to address is number of hits and shots. It's in a different color, and that's because that's something that we frequently see when we're watching TV. We can interpret patterns to tell you what may look like how many hits and shots were taking place, but it's after bloodshed begins. We can't tell you about anything that occurred before the bloodshed began. So if there's 10 hits before bloodshed and I only see 3 separate patterns, that to me looks like 3 hits, but in reality there were 13. The best source for interpreting this is probably the medical examiner, because they frequently will count up how many sharp force injuries they see, how many gunshot injuries they see, how many blunt force injuries they see. It's clearly a more accurate interpretation. So as I said, where you see this is it's frequently when you're watching TV and the investigator walks in and looks around and says, oh, he was hit 3 times with the baseball bat standing in the corner. Oops. Additional things, if there's, depending on the crime scene and what's there, identities and activities of individuals present during the event. That's probably the most common activity that I'm involved in as a bloodstain pattern analyst. The individual that says I wasn't there, that I came in, it was already over, I checked to see if the decedent was alive or dead, or I gave them CPR, some type of story that puts them there, but not involved. And then what happens when we examine their clothing is we see blood stains that may indicate not only were they there at the time blood's being spattered, but because of the size of the stains involved, they were up close and personal. That tends to contradict many of the stories presented. Other things that we may see, bloody shoe prints left behind, which can be compared. Fingerprints, very common thing to find on crime scenes. And then weapon identification. Sometimes they take their weapons with them, and if it has a distinctive shape and it's covered with blood and it gets laid down on another surface or wrapped in something to hide it, it transfers that shape and image to the surface it's in contact with. And then in some scenes, if there's enough information, we can actually sequence the events that took place to create and place the bloodstains where they are. Why can we do this? Because we're working with blood, and blood is not the same as blood, as looking at water and other liquids. So first of all, composition of blood. The average 150 to 180 pound person has between 4.7 and 5 liters of blood present in their body, which would equate to 1.2 to 1.5 gallons. Blood is a mixture. It's solids suspended in a liquid. What keeps them suspended? The beating of your heart. So when your heart stops beating, that's where we start to see the solids settling out, and that is defined as lividity by the medical examiner, because the solids will sink in the direction of gravity to the lowest spots in the body. The solids make up approximately 45% of the total blood volume, And these particular components are not water soluble, so they stay in a solid condition while they're in the bloodstream. The liquid is the remaining 55%. It contains numerous components also, but all the components that are contained in the liquid are water soluble, so you don't see them as solids. So the factors that are most important for us in terms of working with blood are that it's a solid suspended in a liquid, the viscosity of blood, which is defined as the property of a fluid that resists the force tending to cause the fluid to flow. So water having a lesser viscosity than blood flows easily when it's deposited on vertical surfaces. Blood, if it doesn't have sufficient volume, will not flow. It will maintain its shape and its droplet appearance on those vertical surfaces. The other thing that allows us to work with blood in any liquid is surface tension. Surface tension is what causes the liquid to pull together. So when you get any liquid, say on a horizontal surface, if you've ever noticed, it looks like a little bubble of that liquid. Well, that's the surface tension that creates that. And what it is the molecules of the liquid pull inwards towards the center, and it creates what would theoretically be the equivalent of almost a plastic cover over the surface of that liquid, keeping it in that little droplet appearance. Other factors that can affect what we see are affect drying times, which is important in a bloodstain pattern analysis, because the faster it dries, the less chance there is that it will be altered by activities that take place after deposition. So factors that affect drying are temperature, humidity, volume of blood, target surface characteristics. Temperature, there's a big variation. If you live in Florida, it's always warm and it can be very hot. Blood tends to dry faster under those conditions. However, it's also affected by humidity. So in southern Florida, where I'm from, the humidity during the summer is in the 90 percentile or higher range, and the temperatures are in the 90s. Under those conditions, it actually slows down the drying of the blood because the humidity prevents the water that's in the blood from migrating out of it, allowing it to dry. Or let's look at, let's say you have a crime scene that's outdoors in a place like Minnesota in February. That blood doesn't dry, it freezes. Volume, this is pretty self-explanatory. The more blood there is, the longer it takes to dry. And target surface characteristics are a major consideration. Some surfaces lend themselves to faster drying than others. The surfaces that lend themselves to the blood drying faster are the ones that expose large amounts of the blood to the surrounding environment. So if you have a tabletop that's smooth and non-porous, a drop of blood would dry much faster on the tabletop than the same volume being placed on carpeting. And the reason it would dry faster is because on the tabletop, the entire droplet's exposed to the environment. On carpeting is designed to pull dirt into the fibers to make it stay clean and look clean longer. Well, it does the same with liquids. So if you deposit that same volume of blood on a piece of carpet, it gets sucked down into the base of the carpet and into the padding below it. It protects it from the environment, and it can stay wet for months if there's large volumes. So same amount of blood, different surface characteristics affect the drying times. Other factors we look at in bloodstain pattern analysis: bloodstain shape and the surface characteristics. Is it a smooth surface? Is it a rough surface? Is it a porous surface? These factors affect the appearance of the bloodstains when they're deposited on them. So here's 3 examples. These are all identical volumes of blood, all falling to the surface that you see them on from a height of 39 inches, which is approximately 1 meter. On a rough, non-porous surface, if you look at that droplet of blood, the margins are very spiny or stellite. That's because it hits the surface, and as a blood drop hits a surface, there's a crowning effect that occurs, and it splashes upward and away from the blood stain if it's a rough surface. That's because of the unevenness of the surface. On a smooth surface, that same volume of blood, non-porous smooth surface, will have a very well-defined shape and margins. And then when you get to porous surfaces, it really changes everything because the blood starts to soak into the surface. So in this example, it's a rough porous surface, so you still see the blood spattering outward to create secondary spatter or satellite spatter. But then as the blood soaks into the surface, you lose the apparent round shape. When you look at the first two pictures, you can still see to some degree that these are round stains. And when you look at the third picture, that one has an almost square appearance to it. And that's because as the blood soaks into any surface, it doesn't necessarily soak in evenly across that surface. It's going to soak in based on, the characteristics of the surface and the porosity of it. So you may have some areas that have a better absorbency than others. The other thing we look at in terms of shape is created by the angle of impact that the blood stain is deposited on the surface from. So if I splash blood and it creates blood stains flying through the air, those blood stains, if they hit another surface, will show different shapes depending on the angle they hit that surface from. So this is a video. First, when blood flies through the air, any liquid flies through the air, it takes on the shape of an oscillating sphere. So can you run this video, please? All right, so what you're looking at here is a drop of blood coming off a pipette. And as you can see, it's got a drop shape effect as it's connected to the pipette, but almost instantly, once it disconnects from the pipette, it forms a sphere. This is important because you frequently see in articles or writings from people who don't know about liquids free falling, they'll show them as a droplet formation, and that's not how it works. The other thing you can see in this video is that it oscillates width to length. Now the oscillation, the question that frequently comes up there is, does that affect angle of impact appearance of the stain? And it doesn't, because the oscillation dampens and comes to a stop relatively fast as the droplet is moving through the air. So studies that have been done indicate that it's not a factor in the width to length ratios that we use for reconstructing bloodstain patterns. All right, so shape is dependent on angle of impact. So this picture here depicts blood that hits a surface either perpendicular or very close to perpendicular, 90 through 70 degrees. And what you see here at 90 degrees is you get round droplets. At 80 degrees, they still appear round because the difference in width to length on an 80-degree drop is so minimal, you won't be able to visually see it. At 70 degrees, you can start to see that it's slightly longer than it is wide, but again, on small drops, it's very difficult to see. In the mid-range, which we'll get to momentarily, they start to lengthen out clear and very visible. Can you run this video? This shows blood dropping onto a surface. This is at 90 degrees. And what you're seeing here is how the blood reacts on a smooth surface. Now, if that was a rough surface, you would have seen spines coming up and potentially satellite spatter coming out from it. So 90 degrees, we get round drops. Now, in the mid-range, as I said, we start to see very well-defined length to width ratios. And by the time we get to the very acute angles, 10, 20, 30, everything in between, we get very long, narrow stains that have what looks like a tail on them. And the tail is important because it tells us the direction the blood was moving in at the time it impacted on the surface we see it. So that tail, in this picture, it's running from my right to my left, means that the blood, when it was put on those surfaces, on that surface, was moving from right to left. And this picture here, can we run this picture, this video? We'll show you how it forms. All right, So the tail is secondary spatter. As you saw, a portion of the main body of blood tears away from the drop as it attaches to the surface and continues moving in the direction of travel that it was traveling in. That creates the tail. That is frequently referred to as wave castoff. All right, so these videos you've seen and some of the ones that are coming up, these are the results of research that was done using federal grant. And as a result of that research, high-speed digital analysis of bloodstain pattern formation from common bloodletting mechanisms, these videos are available for free to anyone who's interested in them. And the link for these videos is the link you see here on the screen. If you decide you want to download these videos, you can. I recommend you have a big hard drive because they're over 6 gigabytes in size, the entire collection. But it's very informative in understanding what happens under different circumstances, how bloodstain patterns are formed. And these videos were created by Dr. Michael Taylor of the ESR in New Zealand, Bart Epstein, who's retired from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and Terry Labor, who's also retired from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. All right, so as I said previously, we can reconstruct certain types of patterns. And the purpose of a reconstruction is to show us the approximate location of the blood source that created those patterns. The patterns that we focus in on when we do a reconstruction are impact patterns. Impact patterns are blood that's splashed as a result of something hitting it. And the satellite or secondary spatter that splashes out from the pool of blood frequently leaves behind distinctive patterns that we can interpret as to how much force was involved, and reconstruct if it's on a surface that doesn't distort it too much, and show the approximate location of the blood source for that pattern. So in a reconstruction, we're interested in several factors. We have to start out working in a two-dimensional format. So the first thing we try and do is see if there is an area that the bloodstains we're looking at have in common. And if they do, that area is referred to as an area of bloodstain convergence. So the crisscrossing area for these bloodstains in this image here, that's the convergence area. Now you may notice that it's not a nice, tight, clean crisscrossing. The reason for that is, one, the inaccuracy of working backwards, which is a minor aspect of it. More important is that the puddle of blood that gets hit has dimensions to it. And when it gets hit, the blood that comes out of it, is splashed out of it, comes out from all around whatever hits into it. So they're not coming from all the same exact location. So you get a convergence that is a crisscrossing location rather than a pinpoint location. Keep in mind, on any reconstruction, it's an approximation. There are certain assumptions we make that pretty much make it impossible for us to give you an exact location. But if you're concerned about how accurate is it? Well, first of all, this is a practice makes perfect type reconstruction. So the more experience the analyst has, hopefully the better they are. But the reality is, if we have a reconstruction, let's say you're in a 10 by 10 room with 10-foot ceilings, so more than 100 square feet. A reconstruction, if it's done well, would narrow the blood source location down to about the size of a soccer ball or a basketball. Now think in terms of how many basketballs you could put in that 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot room. So by narrowing it down to one basketball, you're really cutting out 99.9% of the possibilities. So accuracy, if the analyst is good at the work and well trained and experienced, is very good. All right, after we find convergence, how do we find the three-dimensional reconstruction? Because convergence basically shows me, going back real quick, two-dimensional. So what this tells me is that somewhere perpendicular to those crisscrossing lines, perpendicular above that area, was the blood source that created that pattern. So how do we find the blood source? Well, this goes by measuring the stains. We measure the width at the widest point, and we measure the length. Now you'll notice in this picture here, I didn't measure the entire length. The reason being, when blood attaches to a surface, it spreads and it elongates. We know from research that was done in 1990 by a person by the name of Pat Laternis with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He's retired now. We know from research he did that on long, narrow stains, the length we visually see is not the true length of the stain as it was deposited on that surface because of lengthening and spreading. What we're really trying to do is define a perfect ellipse. That is the true length. So what you see in this picture is the defined ellipse for that particular stain. After that, after we know the width and length, we can use a calculation. The impact angle equals the arc sine, so it's trigonometry. And we use the width to length ratio, the smallest dimension over the longest one. So in this stain, because we have a width of 16 and a length of 32, we would plug those numbers in. Nowadays we use calculators. When I learned to do this back in the prehistoric times, we had to do this by hand and use do the calculations, then use trigonometric tables to find the arc sines. But 16 divided by 32 is 1/2. The arc sine of 1/2, which is 0.5, works out to an impact angle of 30 degrees. So that means the flight path of that blood stain to the surface it was deposited on was angled to that surface at 30 degrees. So you would go back, you've demonstrated which stains have a common convergence area. You would go back and measure each of those stains, width and length. You would do the calculation to determine angle of impact. And then if you're doing this by hand, we have computers that can do this now also, you would run strings attached to what appears to be the front of the stain to a post coming out of the convergence area that's perpendicular, and it shows you an area of origin. And again, the area of origin is a range. The range being because, as I said before, the blood doesn't come off of all the same exact spots of the blood source that was hit, as well as because you're measuring the stain, there are inaccuracies in the measurement. The inaccuracies are human, as well as a factor of the size of the stain. Bigger stains are easier to measure than small stains. So they have a higher level of accuracy when you measure them. But again, this still translates back to showing location of the blood stain in an area based on the size of a basketball or a soccer ball. And if you have a large room that can contain hundreds, if not thousands of those basketballs or soccer balls, it's a fairly accurate reconstruction. The other factor you need to keep in mind on this reconstruction is that it is usually higher above the floor than the blood source truly was. And this is because the science of reconstructing is based on the blood traveling straight lines. It doesn't travel a straight line. We know that there's a parabolic arc to it. So if I determine that the blood source is 39 inches above the floor, the reality is that it's probably more in the 30-inch range. But there's no means for us to correct for that parabolic arc. Even the computer programs that do these reconstructions don't correct for it because it's too unpredictable. All right, so that's how I would reconstruct impact patterns. Those are the ones we look for and we can glean the most information from, but there's numerous types of patterns that you may have heard about as you had evidence involving bloodstain pattern analysis. So what I'd like to address here is the most common patterns and the current terminology. Now, the current terminology is a document that was published originally in 2008 by the Scientific Working Group on Bloodstain Pattern Analysis. It was published by the FBI in one of their publications. And then when the OSAC was founded in 2015, the BPA subcommittee set about updating that terminology because in science, terminology frequently needs to be tweaked or added to or taken away from. So in 2015, the BPA subcommittee started looking at terminology. In 2017, November 2017, a modified from the Swigstein terminology was published by the Academy Standards Board, which is affiliated with the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Any standard technical document or guidelines that is coming out from the BPA OSAC subcommittee is being sent to the ASB for publication. There you can find that by going to the American Academy website and clicking on the links for the ASB. It will show you any document that is open for public comment, any document that's been published, as well as what type of document it is. Is it a standard, is it a technical document, or a guideline? The differences between documents. Standards are things that basically are being published and saying that if you're going to do this, you must follow these standards if you're a laboratory or facility is planning to adopt them. So they're requirements. Technical documents are things like terminology. Knowing that terminology can change frequently, it's easier to to update and change technical documents than it is standards. And then guidelines, those are the things that are recommended that you should do, but are not at the level of standards, so they're not perceived as requirements. All right, so impact patterns. As I said previously, impact patterns are what we look for the most. That is liquid blood that is being splashed because something hits it. What the pattern looks like is dependent on the surface it's deposited on. It's dependent on the surface that it was on when it was hit. It's dependent on what hits it. It's dependent on how hard the hit was. But there are certain things that we can look at in the patterns and interpret. The harder the hit in most situations, the more blood stains created and put in flight. The harder the hit, the more numerous the number of small blood stains increases and large blood stains decrease. The distribution of these patterns is usually radial, which means it's rounded, and the area that it will cover in terms of total surface it's deposited on, again, is dependent on how hard or soft the hit was. So when I look at a pattern that I perceive to be an impact pattern, I'm interested in the number of blood stains. I'm interested in the general size of the blood stains and where they're deposited within the pattern. I'm looking to see if it appears to be a radial pattern, because it frequently is. And I'm looking to see how much surface area it covers. So these pictures that you both see here are impact patterns. Now notice in this impact pattern, you have an area that's not blood droplets. It is a large volume of blood deposited on the surface. Well, that's because of how fluid dynamics affects liquids as they're spattered. The liquid compresses. And as the blood comes out from whatever's hitting into it, it comes out in arms or what look like tentacles. And those then break up as they move away from the liquid source. And that's where you start to see the droplets. So in a case like this, where the blood source that was impacted was very close to the target, not all the blood had an opportunity to be broken up to break up into blood droplets, and it hits the target as a wave rather than the individual droplets. So this next video is going to show you what I was just talking about. So can you run the video, please? See how the blood came up as a sheet and what looks like tentacles, and then it broke up into the droplets? Run it one more time, please.
Sure.
Right. That demonstrates the fluid dynamics of any liquid when it's impacted, but blood in this case is what we're interested in. It comes up as sheets, it breaks up into the droplets as it moves away from the blood source, and how many droplets it breaks into and the size of the droplets is dependent on how hard the hit was. Another pattern that you frequently hear, especially on television, are cast-off patterns. This is blood that flows off swinging objects. So if you are beating somebody, say with a baseball bat, and it becomes coated with blood, every time you rear back to get ready to hit again, the blood on that item is potentially going to flow off of it. And those patterns are very distinctive. Most cast-off patterns are linear in appearance, and we can actually see the motion of the swing. Not all cast-off patterns are linear, though, because it's very dependent on the motion of the swing. So if you have a motion that is straightforward, the cast-off and straight back, the cast-off that comes off of that item isn't going to show that linear impression. So this is cast-off happening. This video is hard to see, but this is blood coming off a wrench being swung. Run the video, please. And if you watch carefully, you see blood stains coming off of it. Again, it starts to come off in a wave and it breaks up as it moves. The size of the stains flowing off of the item are very dependent on how much volume of blood there is on it, as well as the surface characteristics. Is it a wide surface, a narrow surface? Is it a surface that easily holds onto the blood, making it difficult for it to flow off, or does it flow off easily? So there are certain factors that will affect the size and the distribution of the blood stains. The other thing that we know about cast-off patterns is they are more equivalent, based in fluid dynamics, to passively dripping blood in how they're formed, rather than active pattern creation like we would see in impact spatter. Another common thing that we hear about frequently are gunshot spatter. This is a spatter that is a result of something being shot with by a gunshot. There's two different situations that occur here, or actually three. I'll go into those. On any gunshot that's through and through, we may see back spatter, which is blood that spatters from the entry site back towards the weapon. We may see forward spatter, which is the blood that flows out with the projectile as it makes an exit. The forward spatter is frequently more prevalent than the back spatter. But these patterns are greatly affected by what's being shot. So if there's hair in the way, clothing in the way, we might not see these patterns at all, or they might be very diminished in appearance. Another characteristic of gunshot spatter that's really important is this is an extremely forceful event. We have a projectile that's traveling at a high rate of speed, anywhere between 900 feet per second and I think the top is like 3,200 feet per second as the projectile exits the muzzle of a rifle. They're traveling very fast, so there's a lot of energy involved. So the energy affects the appearance of the pattern. The other thing that affects the appearance of the pattern is the shape of the projectile. And what I have frequently seen in my studies in this area is that very blunt, wide projectiles, frequently, even if they're moving at a slower speed, velocity, frequently create more blood spatter than the tapered cylindrical projectiles you may see coming out of a rifle, which travel at much higher speeds. So we get back spatter, we get forward spatter, and then we also get, if there's multiple gunshots, if blood starts to pool and the multiple gunshots are in or near the pooling blood, it causes splashing also, which is more in appearance like a traditional gunshot spatter or a traditional impact spatter. So gunshot spatters tend to have hundreds, if not thousands, of very small droplets, 1 millimeter and less in size. Whereas the second gunshot situation I told you about, then we start to see much larger droplets because it's not as forceful a spattering of blood. Now, on this video, which will run momentarily, what I want you to see, one of the things that many analysts will comment on is that on suicides, where we have a gun that's either in contact with the decedent or very close to them, it's not unusual to have no blood on that gun, which doesn't seem logical, because if it's right there up close in contact or very close to the blood source as they're being shot, you would anticipate seeing blood on the gun. For years, we didn't really have an explanation for it, but these videos I've been showing you may answer the question. So if you watch very carefully on this is a gunshot spatter demonstration with a .22 from close range, and they're shooting into a bloody sponge. You will see, if you watch closely, blood flying back in the back spatter manner towards the projectile and the gun, but watch the gases from the gun as they come forward towards the blood source. Can you run it, please? If you're watching carefully, you'll see that all the blood stains, for the most part, get turned around and pushed back towards the blood source as they interact with the gases coming out of the gun. This might explain why we don't see back spatter frequently on guns involved in suicides. Another common pattern, projected patterns. The most common source for this is transection of, partial transection of an artery. Arteries are the vehicle that blood flows through as it leaves our heart, heading out to the organs. And it's a very high pressure situation. So if an artery is partially transected, the blood will squirt out of it potentially like a squirt gun, and it leaves behind very distinctive patterns. The satellite spatter pattern on projected blood patterns can be very long, spindly in appearance. As the pressure diminishes because you're running out of blood and starting to die, that spindly appearance rapidly disappears, but we see very distinctive patterns as a result of projected blood. So this is an example of how projection may look using a syringe.
Okay.
Yes, sorry. Now, there's several things I want you to note as that video runs. First, we see streams of blood, which are long, but we also see areas where the blood's broken up. So when you're looking at projected blood on vertical surfaces, you see the effects of both that stream and the breakup. So you don't get the blood, in that rendition, you saw the blood mostly hitting in one spot. That's because it's on a horizontal surface. On vertical surfaces, you will frequently see a line of the blood moving across that surface as the blood hits it, because as those streams move forward and start to break up, and as the broken up areas move forward, they don't all hit the vertical surface in the same exact location. So you see very frequently very large elongated patterns. So can we run that one more time just so they can see again? See, as the blood hits the surface, it spatters outward away from where it hit. And there's very long, narrow spines for a lot of the blood stains. Now, in projected blood, it's traveling greater than the pull of gravity. Pull of gravity is 9.8 feet per second, or 32 feet per second, 9.88 meters per second. It has to, because it doesn't have an engine behind it pushing it, it has to slow down to the pull of gravity as it travels. And that's why the farther away the blood is from the surface it gets deposited on, the less distinctive the secondary or satellite spatter becomes. Now, the other area that involves large volumes of blood frequently is splash patterns. And these are essentially the reverse of projected. Both patterns react to hitting a surface and splashing outward. Projected blood is forcibly pushed out towards that surface, whereas splash patterns are falling out passively from large injuries, and they're accelerating based on the pull of gravity. So they're going from zero as they come out of the wound to approaching terminal velocity, or the pull of gravity on that volume of blood. Terminal velocity is different by volume. Larger volumes have a higher terminal velocity, a distance of fall to reach terminal velocity than small volumes, but they're accelerating as they fall. So splash patterns and projected patterns on horizontal surfaces at some point could look the same, and you may not be able to interpret what you're looking at without additional information. The additional information that you would need in many cases is the medical information, the autopsy report, or if they're not dead, the medical intervention that was taken to close the wounds. So if you have what you perceive to be an impact or a projected pattern, you need to have something that indicates that there was a major artery or a large vein that was transected, in which the blood could pump out. Now, our projected blood out of veins is unusual, but it does occur. But it's usually the artery that's been damaged and causes a projected pattern. So if you don't have a major vein or an artery cut, then in many cases you're able to eliminate the idea that it is a projected pattern. Now, even if you do have a major vein or artery cut, it could still be a splash pattern depending on if the blood's pooling anywhere before it falls away from the blood source. So they're not mutually exclusive. This is an example of splash blood. And again, just like in the projected, it doesn't all necessarily hit in the same exact spot, and it doesn't all hit at once. It breaks up as it falls. What both patterns do have in common is they will usually have a large area of blood from where they hit the surface they're on. So there's usually some type of pooling that you will observe. Drip patterns, because people are moving around and bleeding and dripping blood, we see different types of drip patterns. Now, this type of drip pattern is that when they're stationary, the blood can drip into pre-existing pools of blood formed by other drips. And that causes, if it hits on the edges, satellite spatter to occur. So let's take a look at this video and you'll see how that happens. So when the blood impacts into a pre-existing pool of blood, it's going to cause a splashing effect and satellite spatter. Now in this, you'll notice that the shape of the satellite spatter, there's a lot of variation in the size, but there's also, there are also very thick blood stains. We didn't see that on any of the previous patterns that I've shown you. So drip patterns are the result of passively dripping blood falling into pre-existing spots where the blood has dripped. We need to go forward. Drip trails, that's when there's horizontal motion. There's also drip stains where it's just individual drips that fall and nothing interferes with them. Drip stains make up a drip trail. And so you have to understand the terminology when you read a report to understand, are we talking about a drip stain versus a drip trail versus a drip pattern? There's variations in them. Drip trails are, horizontal motion, so the blood source is running, walking, crawling, but they're moving horizontally across the surfaces as the blood's being deposited, and it leaves behind trails. Those trails, by looking at the individual blood stains, you can frequently determine the direction of travel for those trails. And in cases like this, where it's on carpet and the blood stains aren't going to tell you direction of travel, there's frequently a body at one end. So logic dictates that the body is the terminal end. Another type of trail that you may see are the ones caused by dragging of the blood source. So what you see here are swipes and wipes caused by the blood source being dragged across the flooring to its final location. And again, in many of these drag type trails, you can look at the characteristics of the blood stain and determine the direction that the movement was in. And again, going back to the previous statement, there's frequently a body at one end, which does help define direction of movement. Last area of common bloodstain pattern analysis terminology is transfer stains. This is when you have blood that's on a surface and it comes in contact while wet with another surface. And you can have two types of occurrences here. You can have a nondescript pattern like this one, so I don't know, looking at this, what it was transferred from, or you can have just descriptive transfers. Those would be things like shoe prints and fingerprints, where you can actually take the details of the transfer, compare them back to a known set of prints or a known shoes if they're gotten within a reasonable period of time after the pattern being made, and say that this shoe or this finger transferred the blood to this surface. And that's really important information, because in crime scenes involving latent prints, there's frequently an argument that, oh, well, my prints were pre-existing because I worked there, I lived there, something of that nature. So my prints are going to be there. The blood probably flew through the air, landed on the print, and made it visible. For years, it was known that that's not the case, but it turns out there wasn't a lot of research into it. There has been studies done in recent times demonstrating that when you get a positive print being defined as an image of the ridges on your fingers or your feet or your palms, when you get a positive print, that's not because the blood flew through the air and interacted with a pre-existing print. It's because it was transferred from that hand, that foot, that shoe, that finger, whatever, a direct transfer from that surface to the non-bloody surface. Now, going back to blood flying through the air and making the print visible, yes, it can happen, but the prints are a negative print. What you're seeing there in terms of fingerprints is the imaging of the furrows that are present between the ridges. So it's a negative print because it's not showing you the ridges, it's showing you the furrows, which then infer what the ridge patterns are. So based on studies that have been done, myself included having done one, when we get a print at a crime scene that is a positive print, an image of the ridges, I'm comfortable as a forensic analyst in saying that that's from direct transfer. Now, I'll never exclude the possibility that the other occurred, because we learn in forensics that nothing's impossible, but the odds of that happening, I think, are so remote that I probably have a better chance of winning the Florida lottery than that happening. So if I get a positive print from a finger in blood, and it's the victim's blood, that's highly probative information. And that's where DNA comes in, because DNA is going to take a portion of that print and verify whose blood it is. All right, so as attorneys, the other things you're interested in, other than a basic understanding of bloodstain pattern analysis, are the current state of bloodstain pattern analysis versus law. So as I said, the Organization of Scientific Area Committees is involved with the strengthening of the nation's use of forensic science by facilitating the development of technically sound forensic science standards and by promoting the adoption of these standards by the forensic science community. These standards are in the form of written documents that define minimum requirements, best practices, standard protocols, and other guidance to help ensure that the results of forensic science analysis are reliable and reproducible. So the reliability and reproducibility of any form of analysis we use is important. How do we know reliability and reproducibility? Before any science gets used now in a forensic setting, it goes through a validation process. And the validation process is designed to test out the science under many different conditions to see if there's variations that cannot be standardized. So after the completion of a validation process, the SOP for a standard operating procedure is usually written, and then the laboratory or crime scene facility will start using that technology. The OSAC, the most difficult thing with the standards coming out from the OSAC is at present there is no methodology for forcing laboratories and agencies to adopt the standards. That is actually a new field that NIST, National Institute of Science and Technologies, which oversees the OSAC, is working on overcoming. And they're doing public outreach by going to the labs and by going to professional conferences and all, and presenting what's going on. For some groups, these are required to be accepted through accreditation. So if it's an accredited lab and the accreditation agency adopts the standards, then they put into their accreditation policies that those standards have to be adopted by the groups they accredited. So that's one way to bring them in. Another way that's being looked at is through federal funding. Certain areas of forensic science get massive amounts of federal funding, in particular DNA. There is discussion now of potentially tying federal funding to acceptance of standards. So if you're getting federal funds and you don't want to accept the standards that are being published and you're doing that type of analysis that the standard applies to, there is discussion of cutting off the federal funding until you accept the standard. So moving forward, there is no rules right now saying that standards have to be adopted, but there are steps being taken to ultimately require those adoptions down the road. Now, in terms of BPA and the OSAC has been in existence for 5 years now. It takes time for these groups to get their ducks in order and start publishing and getting documents and standards out there. So some groups have more out than others, but for the most part, we have just in the last year seen most of the groups in the OSAC start to get documents published by standard development organizations. So the OSAC, just to make it clear, we write the documents, we create them, but because we're not a standard development organization, we don't publish the documents. They get sent to groups that specifically work in standard developments. So as I said, for BPA, we're sending those to the Academy Standards Board. There's hundreds of standard development organizations available, but very few of them have a forensic orientation. ASTM is one of them. ASB is another, which I just said. But we're limited in where we can send our standards because there's just not a lot of groups that look at forensic documents. Now, before a standard is published, it goes out for public comment, so people working in the field can comment on it, and those comments, every single one has to be addressed and adjudicated, sometimes resulting in changes to the document, sometimes not. If there's significant changes, the document will go out for a second round of public comment, but prior to ever being published, they go out for public comment to the community. ASB sends them out for 45 days, and they announce this on numerous forensic websites, and giving the community a chance to comment on them. The comments are then addressed so that when the final document does come out, it hopefully is relevant to the community and is workable for the community. All right, so as I said, OSAC is administered by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, commonly referred to as NIST. There's 550 members in the OSAC. They're from government agencies, academic institutions, the private sector, research facilities. The OSAC tries to maintain a cross-section of the entire community, not just the forensic community and the practitioners. Also present on every OSAC subcommittee and committee is a statistician, because with the Dauber rules, we have to apply statistics to much of what we do now. OSAC members work together to develop and evaluate forensic science standards via a transparent consensus-based process that allows for participation and comment by all stakeholders. So even at the OSAC, when the OSAC has a registry of documents, in order for a document to be placed on the registry, it must go out for public comment before it can ever get there, and all public comments have to be addressed and adjudicated. So very similar to what the standard development organizations do. The difficulty that the OSAC was originally met with was what happens when a document is published by the SDO, a document developed by OSAC and published by an SDO, and then it comes back to be placed on the OSAC registry. What happens if the public comments differ and suggest changes that aren't in the published document? So they're still trying to work out that situation when a document doesn't, too many comments suggest that it's not ready for the OSAC registry, but it's published as a standard. Hopefully it doesn't happen very often, but we know the potential's there. All right, so in terms of bloodstain pattern analysis, we have 2 documents published to date by the Academy Standards Board. One is the ASB Technical Report 033, Terms and Definitions in Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, which I said was published in 2017. So these are the terminology that we're recommending everyone use now. And it's important because in the past there was no common terminology. So even though we all spoke the same, we may have defined some terms different enough to create misunderstandings. The other document, this just came out in May of this year, is ANSI ASB. ANSI is the parent organization for the standard development organizations now. Standard 072, Standard for the Validation of Procedures in Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, first edition 2019. So this is now a standard that is available for anyone using bloodstain pattern analysis to go through a full rigorous validation of that procedure before it's used. Now, like any other forensic sciences, procedures that were in use before all these standards were developed are not validated frequently. It doesn't mean they have to go back and retroactively validate them. If they have enough data to indicate that there aren't problems with the science, they can continue forward. But with the advent of DNA in the late 1990s, validation became the must-have for virtually everything that's done in a forensic setting. But prior to the late 1990s, validation was seldom used. And many of the procedures, the older procedures that may still be in use, like presumptive testing for the presence of blood, if you've been doing that for 40 years, you weren't required to go back and validate it. All right, we also have several documents that are at the ASB for future publication. One is a standard for minimum training and education requirements for bloodstain pattern analysts. This is a critical document because it lays out what training a person should have before they ever become a testifying report writing analyst. And it specifies that there's far more than a 40-hour introductory course necessary before you start working. It has the physics component, it has the fabrics component, the textile component. It has a mentorship. So while you're training and before you complete your training, you must be working under the guidance of a qualified analyst for some period of time. So it lays out all the requirements for becoming a bloodstain pattern analyst in clear, certain terms. This document is currently out for recirculation, which means it's been out once for public comment. Those public comments have been adjudicated, and they created enough changes in the document that it required that it be sent out for recertification for public comment on the changes. So the only part of the document that is open for discussion now, public comment-wise, are any changes that were made. This document is present on the ASB website if you're interested. It is out for public comment until I believe September 23rd. And at which point all the new comments will have to be adjudicated and addressed prior to sending it up the chain of command to hopefully be published. And again, if there's too many changes that occur as a result of the recirculation, it would go out for a second round of recirculation. Another document at ASB is guidelines for report writing in bloodstain pattern analysis. Reports are important, they need to be written. Years ago in the past, it was not uncommon for bloodstain pattern analysts to not write a report. They just, get on the witness stand and testify. Unfortunately, that still occurs. Either both sides will do this. They will put somebody on who is maybe a detective or an investigator. They'll start asking them questions about the crime scene, and they'll ask them, oh, well, did you observe bloodstain patterns at the crime scene? And they'll frequently reply yes, and then they'll get asked a series of questions about the interpretation of the patterns. That is bad science. People should not be getting on the witness stand and testifying about what's there if they haven't written a report. The only exception to that is if they're a rebuttal witness, because if there's a rebuttal witness, there frequently isn't time to write a report. And writing a report isn't just a case of writing the report in a couple hours period of time and then submitting it as a final report. proper procedure for writing forensic reports, regardless of its bloodstain pattern analysis, DNA, chemistry, whatever, is the analyst writes the report. It then goes to a second qualified analyst for a technical review to make sure that it's correct. After that, it then goes through the process of being finalized and going out. But without technical review, reports should not go out. So in a setting where the expert is a rebuttal expert, there's barely time to write a report, let alone get it technically reviewed before they testify. But since their testimony is usually restricted to commenting on the testimony previously given, the reports, you can get by without the report. The report writing document is finished. It's waiting to go up the chain of command for final publication, so that document might be issued by the ASB within the next month or two. The other document at the ASB is Standards for Quality Assurance Program and Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, and that is getting ready to go out for public comment for the first time around. So again, that will be published on the ASB website for anyone who's interested to comment on the criteria outlined in that document. Going back to the OSAC level, we have draft documents that are currently being worked on. One is a standard for a certification program for bloodstain pattern analysts. So it's defining the standards for what a certification program should look like. And it's being discussed. We also put in that document the requirement that at some point after completing training and becoming a testifying report writing analyst, must the analyst be certified. Certification doesn't mean that they can do the job well, but it means that they understand the science. So it's a written test of some type, usually quite long, 3 hours or in length, testing the knowledge of the analyst as well as their ability to interpret complex patterns. As I said, the only certification test available for bloodstain pattern analysis people currently is put out by the International Association for Identification, the IAI. And of the several hundred bloodstain analysts worldwide, there's only about 45 currently certified. Down the road, if this becomes mandatory, that'll change. We're also working on a standard for documentation and review of case experimentation. Sometimes it's necessary to do experimentation while you're working a case to understand the patterns you're looking at and to verify your opinions and conclusions. So this would be a standard outlining what is necessary to be done documentation-wise for doing the experimentation. So it's in your record that you did it and what you did, what you found, and how you did it. So that would go in your case folder. We're working on a standard for technical review of bloodstain pattern analysis reports. As I said, all reports, regardless of if it's bloodstain pattern analysis, DNA, chemistry, whatever, have to have a technical review. Well, the technical review varies by the science. What is necessary to review to make sure that it is a thorough and complete technical review? So this is a standard for that. And the last standard that's currently in development is a standard for operating procedures. So if you're in a facility that's doing bloodstain pattern analysis, this would guide you in what are the needs in a standard operating procedure manual for your agency, how to create it. Other work products that we've done, there is a process map that we're currently in the process of testing. Process maps show you how the analysis is done, starting from getting the call saying you have a scene to go to or evidence to look at, to the writing of a report. How do we test a process map? We basically gave it back to everyone in the subcommittee and said, take it back to your agencies and see if you can use it and where does it create problems for you or break. Ultimately, the process map will get published on the OSAC website. We have published on the OSAC website research needs in bloodstain pattern analysis. What are the areas that we work in that currently could use more research to show that our understanding is complete? And present on the website by topic and by date, two separate links, is a bibliography of all the identified published materials in bloodstain pattern analysis, which currently is up to date through the end of 2018 and numbers more than 700 publications. I went the wrong direction. No, it went the wrong direction. Okay. What should a bloodstain pattern analyst have? One of the questions that I received prior to doing this presentation is cross-examination or voir dire of bloodstain pattern analyst, cross-examination, whatever. You want to learn about their background. So some of the training they can take is on this slide. There's an introductory workshop. We all start out with that. So you have to start somewhere. It teaches you about the dynamics of what happens. It teaches you how to identify a bloodstain scene, and it should teach you at a minimum how to document and preserve that scene so a qualified analyst can work the scene if you don't have one that can attend the scene. Attending the scene is always the best way to go because the analyst then sees everything in 3 dimensions rather than 2 dimensions in photographs and drawings. What types of advanced training can they attend? There's pattern identification training. There's pattern and scene documentation and preservation training. There's the math and physics of bloodstain pattern analysis. Why does it work? There's the fluid dynamics showing how blood drops are formed and how it breaks up and how it flies through the air and how it interacts with surfaces. There's bloodstain pattern analysis on textiles. You should attend medical legal death investigations because virtually every bloodstain case I've ever worked involves reading an autopsy report. You need to be able to understand what you're reading. So by attending a medical legal death investigation course, which are usually 40 hours in length, you get a handle on that. There's mentorship and field training. You don't just do all these courses and go out and start working. You work under the guidance of a trained, experienced analyst at actual crime scenes, examining actual evidence. And then other relevant training attended. This is kind of the catch-all for things that may not seem obvious, but you attend some type of training and realize it applies to my bloodstain pattern training. Again, a lot of those are based on other aspects of death investigation. So when you have an expert and you're going through their qualifications and experience, you want to ask them about what training have they attended and about the training. Was it a course where you were lectured to for the entire time, or was it a course where there was laboratory work where you did hands-on work with liquid blood or items of evidence? How long was the training? Was there a written test at the end? In forensic science now, almost every course that's taught in all areas has some type of a written evaluation at the end to ascertain if the people attending the class understand the basic concepts that were taught in that class. So it's become very much like going to any college level course now and finishing it with a final exam. Does the analyst take proficiency testing? At the end of training, you should go through a competency test. That shows you can do the work and get the right answer. Proficiency testing is an annual test or biannual, depending on the field you're in and the accreditation requirements, that you must take to demonstrate that you're still capable of doing the work and getting the right answer. In BPA, proficiency test, if you're an accredited facility, is annual. But it's not required for all the analysts in your facility because there's not enough BPA tests to go around for everyone to do. So usually it's sufficient. I don't know, the rules could have changed now, but it's been sufficient in the past that one analyst in the group proficiency test once over a 5-year period, and that every year there be a proficiency test for somebody in the group. Now, because somebody else in the group does the technical review, essentially 2 people have done the proficiency test. The person taking it as well as the technical reviewer who's determining if their results are accurate. So proficiency testing in all forensic science is essential because it demonstrates you can get the right answer over years and years of doing your work. And as I said, it's usually annual. The only real exception to that is DNA analysts are required to proficiency test twice a year. Do they attend continual education? It's not sufficient in any forensic science to get your training, get qualified, pass your proficiency test. It's not sufficient to then go on and say, well, I don't need any more training. The science changes. So continuing education shows that you're making an effort to move forward with the science. And for many of the forensic sciences, it's not a required aspect of being an analyst. In fact, the only one I'm aware of where it's required is a DNA analyst to maintain access to CODIS, the combined DNA index that we use for profiling, comparing profiles. They're required to have a minimum of 8 hours of training a year to keep their CODIS access. But no other group seems to have that requirement. So you should be interested in continuing education. Down the road, certification I'm predicting will become a requirement. It's not now, and as I said, there's only about 45 certified analysts. But asking if they're certified implies to the jury that they've taken that extra step to show that they're a qualified analyst. Do they review and read current BPA literature? This is a problem in all forensics. A lot of analysts are too busy to read. You want to know, are they staying up with things that are being published? What do they know about them? Just keep in mind that just because something's published doesn't mean it's correct. Publication isn't always based on accuracy. I am a reviewer for both the Journal of Forensic Sciences and the Journal of Identification. And articles get published if they meet certain criteria that each of those publications has. So it's published with the mindset that it will have peer review by people reading it. And if they disagree with it, they're going to write letters back to the editor or commenting on it, or they're not going to use that particular research or whatever it is. So publication doesn't mean it's correct. And that's a common misconception that if it was published in a technical or peer-reviewed journal, it's good science and it's accurate science. They're two separate things. You may want to ask if they ever provided training to other people in BPA. Were they a mentor for somebody and they oversaw the training of an analyst, or do they teach classes in bloodstain pattern analysis? Those are both show that they're in a situation where they must stay current and up to date with the science and keep their skills as cutting edge as possible. Qualifications and experience, other things, do they belong? These are things that I quite frankly think are minor, but they're all things you may want to ask. Do they belong to any professional associations? Because professional associations have meetings involving training and they publish things, and it gives you the ability to know, are they staying up to date? Have they ever presented a paper at any of those forensic associations? Because that means that they're actually doing studies and presenting it to other experts to see if they agree or disagree or somewhere in between. Those presentations frequently lead to being published. So have they been published? Have they performed independent research? How many times have they testified as an expert? Now everyone has to start somewhere. So at some point, you're going to get an analyst that's going to say, this is my first testimony. Doesn't mean they're not qualified to be an expert. It just means this is their first time testifying as an expert. Have they ever, this is a big one for any forensic science, have they ever been denied the ability to testify by an expert, as an expert in a court of law? Because that can impact their credibility going forward. And have they ever been censured by a professional forensic association? So for ethical violations, for anything that is considered to be a violation of that professional association's bylaws. Have they been censured? And what was the nature of the censure? Was it a slap on the hand, or were they kicked out of the group? Those are all things that would impact the judge and the jury's perceptions of their testimony if they're allowed to give testimony. Okay, I'm starting to get some questions. I'll go back to those momentarily once we finish up the presentation. BPA under fire, this is the last slide. I want to talk about 3 areas. The National Academy of Sciences, Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, A Path Forward. This was published in 2009. It is frequently cited as an example of bloodstain pattern analysis having problems. It is a misrepresentation. If you look at this publication, which is 300 pages long, 300 plus pages long, they spend approximately 2 pages talking about bloodstain pattern analysis. They equate it to other pattern sciences, which it is a pattern science, so they have that in common, but it is not similar to many of the other pattern sciences. Those entire 2 pages basically say that it needs to be looked at in more depth. If you look at their list of references in those 2 pages, they are all references that are extremely old. As I said a few minutes ago, there's over 700 plus publications out there dealing with bloodstain pattern analysis. Yet the references for that site, for the NAS report, are 30 and 40 years old. They went back to some of the earliest literature out there. We know that that's not the best resources. We know that some of that literature had mistakes in it. We know differently now through research and experience how to interpret things that the literature didn't deal with. So my interpretation of what's there, coupled with looking at the agendas. At the back of this book, they published the agenda for every single meeting they had. If you go through those agendas, not one agenda shows that they addressed bloodstain pattern analysis. I'm interpreting all this together as meaning that they forgot to do bloodstain pattern analysis, and as they were nearing publication, somebody noticed it, and they went back and tried to address it very quickly without relying on a lot of research. So the bloodstain pattern analysis and the alleged comments by the NAS report that it's subjective and needs more work, it's not a very well-founded opinion. Now, where you do hear nowadays a lot of discussion is the Texas Forensic Science Commission and BPA. They started looking at bloodstain pattern analysis a year ago because of some cases that were done in the state of Texas in which it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at it and see that there may be problems with the bloodstain pattern analysis testimony that was given in those cases. The one that's received the most press time is the state of Texas versus Joe Bryant. And having seen a lot of what's involved in that case, having talked to the Texas Forensic Science Commission, I have to agree. In that particular case, it looks like the bloodstain pattern analysis testimony was bad. But the thing about forensic science testimony, you can go through all the forensic sciences and find cases for every single area of forensic science in which the testimony and the science was not up to good science standards. The problem with that case was that the analyst had a 40-hour class only a couple months before being put on this crime scene. So it was clearly a person that wasn't qualified yet, experienced, trained well enough, anything, to be doing a bloodstain pattern analysis scene, which is, it opens the door nice and wide for errors to be made. Now, the Texas Forensic Science Commission had 4 options for bloodstain pattern analysis because they're going through every forensic discipline and deciding how they will be used in the state of Texas or not used. They have 4 options. They can say it can continue, but it has to be done by a facility that is accredited, and that all their analysts be state licensed. The state of Texas has a licensing format. They could develop their second option was to develop their own certification process for analysts that do bloodstain pattern analysis and require, again, that they pass the state license. Third possibility was to just not deal with it at this time like they did with latent prints. And the fourth possibility is to say that it was not good science and could not be used in Texas courts, and that's what they did with bite mark analysis. In the end, after hearing from many of us that are in the field, had testifying in front of the members of the commission, they decided to go with option 1, which is that the facility doing the work be accredited and that the analyst be licensed. The problem with that option is that it essentially would have cut bloodstain pattern analysis out of their court systems because they didn't have enough analysts in accredited laboratories to become accredited. They could become licensed, but they couldn't do accreditation or successfully do it because there weren't enough analysts in the labs, because you have to have more than 2 analysts. Many labs only have 1. The second option, certification of the analyst, is now what they've switched over to, and this switch just occurred a couple months ago. So now they've decided that they haven't set a deadline yet, but at some point moving forward, BPA analysts in the state of Texas will have to be certified by a certifying body, which at present is the IAI, and they must pass the state license. So after hearing testimony from bloodstain pattern analysts like myself, they decided that it was scientific, not a junk science, and that it could continue to be used in the state of Texas like the other forensic sciences that they've already reviewed. All right, so these are some additional resources: the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the OSAC, the Academy Standards Board, the links for them, International Association for Bloodstain Pattern Analysts, a link for them. They're the professional group that most of us belong to. The IAI also has a bloodstain pattern division. I am the current chair of the Science and Practice Committee for that at the IAI. And they have a certification program, which is the only ball game in town. And then the last link is just a website for me if you need to contact me and ask questions. So with that, I'm going to address any questions that have been sent in. There's not a lot, but there are. First question: if a contributor of blood has a disease that limits clotting, does that affect interpretation of the pattern? So-called blood thinners like Coumadin, that's been looked at, and no, it doesn't affect the patterns. What it does affect is people that are on the so-called blood thinners bleed much easier, and clotting doesn't occur as fast, so they bleed more. Alcohol will also cause that problem. People who are drunk bleed easier, and so it's not an uncommon thing for a person who is drunk to become injured, and because they don't seek medical intervention because they're drunk, they bleed to death. Prime example of that was the actor William Holden. He had an alcohol abuse problem. He fell and apparently lacerated his head, and he, as a result, bled to death. Next question: in the case of older blood stains, do the stains change shape as they dry? If so, how valid is the analysis? Any stain that's not totally dry, if something interacts with it, it will change shapes. And on textiles, research has shown that until they're 100% dry, that shape can potentially change as it's drying. Once it's dry, no, unless there's something that occurs to re-wet the stains, it's stable. So dry stains, once they're dry, we can interpret them. It doesn't affect the interpretation. The wet stains in the process of drying, we may see alterations and things like that, or we may see new blood stains created by emergency rescue personnel. So it's important for the analyst to be at the scene before anyone starts collecting evidence or moving the body around. If it's they're still alive, that's not a reasonable prospect. They have to take them to the hospital, but we can still do our interpretations. We're not inhibited by changes that occur during the drying process in many situations. And once they're dry, they're not going to change. They're stable. How often do bloodstain patterns become an issue, exculpatory in the appellate process? And for what reasons? Yeah, I don't know if anyone's ever looked to see how often they're exculpatory. But there are situations I've been involved in where, after looking at the patterns, in my opinion, they were exculpatory. So in the appellate process, unless you can demonstrate that the analysis was bad, which hopefully it's not going to become exculpatory in my experience in the appellate process. If it's going to be exculpatory, it's going to be either prior to it ever going to trial and resulting in the charges being dismissed, or they're exculpatory as a presentation at trial. Clearly, one reason can be inadequate analysis. Another reason, discovery of new evidence. It's very important that you've seen everything. Most analysts, myself included, when we write a report, there is a disclaimer in it clearly stating that this report and opinions are based on all the evidence that was reviewed through the date of writing the report. And that additional introduction of new evidence could result in changes to the opinions and conclusions. We know that's so. Out of all the listed qualifications, what are the most important factors to qualify an expert under the Dauber standard? I think it's their training and experience. That's my opinion. You want an analyst who has made an effort to get as much, if not all, of the training that's available and is making an attempt to stay up to date and cutting edge. And you want an analyst that's experienced. Now, granted, everyone starts somewhere, so you may have a situation where the analyst has minimal experience because it's their first time in the witness stand. But experience isn't just the cases they worked since they completed training, it's also all the coursework they took, all the experimentation they did, were they mentored, how many cases did they go to with the mentor? That's all experience. So do they have experience? How well are they trained? I think those are clearly the most important things under Dauber. The issue we really have is with 702 that basically makes who's an expert? Just about anyone and everyone. It's not very stringent in who can qualify as an expert. Basically, if you know more than the average person in the area you're going to testify in, most courts are going to allow you to testify. And that's a problem. Attorney, is the handedness, left or right hand of a perpetrator an appropriate thing for a BPA expert to opine on? Yes, they can opine on that in limited situations, but I don't really think it matters. We're usually talking about violent confrontations. It doesn't matter if you're left-handed or right-handed. If you're right-handed and you can't use your right hand, you're going to use your left hand. So identifying which hand was used, in my opinion, is just kind of extra information that isn't going to provide, did they or could they have done it or not. So going back to Shepard, the testimony by Dr. Kirk that the assailant was left-handed, I don't see it as relevant. So Dr. Shepard was right-handed. It doesn't mean he couldn't use his left hand. And the current last question, could you discuss how bloodstain pattern analysis may impact self-defense cases? That's a hard one because that really depends on the circumstances of the case and the patterns that are there. Florida's a stand your ground state, which means you don't have to retreat. You can actually become the aggressor. And I've been involved in a handful of stand your ground cases in which the defendant has been the aggressor ultimately. Some of them, when you look at the bloodstain pattern analysis, yes, I would say it supports that they may have been defending themselves. But others, I did one in which the defendant says he was attacked by the decedent, and there's evidence that indicates that. But the problem is that the defendant stabbed the decedent 72 times and cut his throat. At some point, when do you go from self-defense to being the aggressor and it's not self-defense? I think there was indications in some of the evidence that it started out as self-defense, but clearly the patterns in this particular case didn't support the story he told to argue it was self-defense. He said that as soon as he was able to extract himself from the situation. He says that he was laying on the ground being straddled by the decedent, and that as soon as he got free and stood up, he stopped defending himself. Unfortunately, the blood on him and his clothing says that there was interaction between him and the decedent after he stood up and allegedly stopped defending himself, which is a big contradiction to the scenario he gave. So there are cases where we can look at it and it can impact a self-defense case, but it's going to be dependent on the case and the evidence that's present, as well as the information being provided by the individual claiming it's self-defense. So sometimes it will impact it in a positive manner, and other times, like the one I just cited, it impacted it in a negative manner. That individual was convicted. All right, well, if there's any more questions, I have time, 5 minutes left to address them. If not, I'd like to thank you for attending, and you have my contact information through some of the slides on this presentation. So if you ever need to ask more questions, by all means, you can contact me.
Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. Please continue to check the Spotlight section of our homepage on ncstl.org for information on upcoming webinars. All webinars are available on demand and can be found on the Education and Training page of our website. Please make sure to fill out the survey that you will be receiving by email. This survey will enable you to receive your CLE information. Contact our Office of Professional Education at ope@law.stetson.edu for further information or questions. On behalf of Stetson University College of Law, the National Clearinghouse, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, our guest speaker, and myself, thank you for attending.